When Donald Trump and his Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth abruptly summoned America's top military brass from around the world to an unusual and short-notice meeting in Virginia at the end of September, it sparked a whole lot of speculation. Some suggested it might be for an oath of loyalty to Trump, while others dramatically evoked Saddam Hussein's infamous Ba'ath Party purge of 1979. In the end, it turned out to be something more akin to a TED Talk mixed with a political rally, with Hegseth laying out plans to release the military from any so-called woke restraints, and Trump delivering a politically charged speech to the room full of generals and admirals, in which he vowed to make greater use of the military in US cities, claiming that the country was facing a, quote, war from within, and suggesting that cities like Chicago, Portland, and Los Angeles should be, quote, training grounds for the military. So in this video, we're going to look at what Trump and Hegseth actually said, whether they're taking the US to the cusp of civil war, as some have implied, and why, even if the answer's probably no, this all still threatens to accelerate a pre-existing and dangerous trend in America, namely the politicization of the military. Never miss an episode and always feel in the loop by subscribing and ringing the bell. So let's start with a quick look at what Hegseth and Trump said in their speeches to military leaders. Hegseth's address centred on his efforts to rid the military of what he deems woke influence, and instead promote a warrior ethos across its ranks. Hegseth said he'd imposed the highest male standard for all combat roles, hitting out at, quote, fat troops and suggesting twice-yearly fitness tests, emphasised the importance of grooming standards, insisting on, quote, no more beardos, defended his firing of several top military officers, suggesting they'd been promoted based on their race or gender, announced he would curtail whistleblower and complaint procedures, and empower drill sergeants to instill a healthy fear in new recruits. On the role of the military, Hegseth said bluntly, you kill people and break things for a living. And on the rules that set out when and how the military can use force, he said, no more politically correct and overbearing rules of engagement, just common sense, maximum lethality, and authority for warfighters. As for Trump, much of what he said, from tariffs to the border to Joe Biden, was what you'd expect from any other of his speeches. But what drew most attention was Trump's comments on the role he envisions the military playing in the domestic arena. Having already deployed National Guard troops to Democrat-led cities like Los Angeles, Washington DC and Portland, and promising future deployments to Chicago and elsewhere, Trump said the military should use dangerous American cities as training grounds, adding that the US was facing a war from within, and calling on the military leaders gathered before him to handle the enemy from within before it gets out of control. This apparent enemy, according to Trump, is, quote, no different than a foreign enemy, but more difficult in many ways because they don't wear uniforms. Unsurprisingly, Trump's talk of the enemy within and the idea of using American cities as, quote, training grounds for the military in the context of what looks like an emerging era of heightened political violence sparked some online chatter about the prospect of civil war in the US. Now, we've got to say, we don't think this is sensible, not least because well, the cities that Trump is talking about are nowhere near as violent or beset by unrest as he likes to imply. Portland, for instance, the current focus of Trump's attention, has previously been described by the president as war-ravaged, with immigration and customs enforcement, or ICE facilities, quote, under siege from attack by Antifa and other domestic terrorists, which is presumably why earlier this month Trump posted on Truth Social that he was authorising full force, if necessary, by the National Guard. But this characterisation has been widely refuted by local residents and politicians. While there have been persistent protests outside an ICE facility, with occasional clashes between agents and protesters, there's nothing like the levels of unrest that Trump has described. Portland Police Chief Bob Day said National Guard troops were not needed, and that the protests have been confined to one small block, in an otherwise big city which local law enforcement can handle. Nonetheless, the Trump administration's apparent willingness to fold the military into political disputes, fire high-ranking officials for apparent political reasons, and deploy it in domestic contexts will still probably accelerate a pre-existing trend, namely the politicization of the military. For context, in the US, as in most liberal democracies, the relationship between the government and the military is supposed to be governed by the principle of civilian control. In other words, the military is supposed to be ultimately subordinate to the civil authority, i.e. the elected government. To this end, it's important that the US military is politically neutral. The US military is supposed to be equally subordinate and responsive to Republican and Democratic administrations alike. This should also help preserve public faith in the military, even while Americans' faith in other institutions is declining. Defining what exactly it means for the military to be politically neutral is difficult, especially because, well, military officers are in some sense experts and will thus have well-informed opinions on war and geopolitical strategy. These might naturally align more with the views of one party than the other, and in these cases the line between providing expert advice and political lobbying becomes somewhat blurred. Nonetheless, even with this caveat, it's clear the US military has become more politicised in recent decades, and this trend precedes Trump. Political commentators generally point to George H.W. Bush's use of veteran endorsements in the 1988 presidential campaign as a beginning of a Republican-Democrat arms race for veteran endorsements, which has escalated at every election since. Similarly, presidents have become increasingly willing to appoint veterans to civilian positions in their cabinet, and use uniformed officers in photo ops. In Trump's first term, General Mark Milley was criticised and ultimately apologised for accompanying Trump in a staged photo op in front of a boarded-up church during the George Floyd protests. And Biden was criticised for placing uniformed Marines beside him during that backlit speech he gave about the risks to American democracy. But while this trend clearly precedes Trump, he threatens to supercharge it, especially if he and Hegseth continue to fire high-ranking officials over what do seem to be political disagreements over quote-unquote wokeness. Republicans might argue that the Democrats essentially started it by imposing wokeness in the first place, but the ultimate effect is the same, a more politicised military. This is bad for a whole load of reasons. It undermines public trust in the military. It means the military has to spend more time worrying about politics and less time preparing for battle. And perhaps most importantly, it undermines the fundamental principle of civilian control, threatening to ultimately upend the balance of power between the military and the government. Ultimately, we live in a world where growing geopolitical and economical issues like these are hitting the headlines every day. While it's easy to sometimes feel overwhelmed, there are ways to stay sharp, and we know that the easiest way to do so is by using Brilliant. That's because Brilliant teaches you by doing, using active learning techniques to train you in the principles behind otherwise complex subjects, and ensuring that you actually understand what's going on. With our ever-growing collection of lessons in topics ranging from maths to science to AI, there's plenty to get you started. Not only does each lesson offer a comprehensive mix of engaging problems and competitive features, but Brilliant also helps you stay consistent, keeping you motivated and excited to learn every single day. Take their newly updated science courses, for example. Here you can learn how to build simple computers out of logic gates, or open your eyes to the world around you by solving puzzles with science. Each lesson will help you develop your scientific intuition through visual interactive problem solving that gets you hands-on with key concepts. Try Brilliant for free and start your learning journey today by visiting brilliant.org/TLDR, scanning the QR code on screen, or clicking the link in the description. By doing so, you'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription, and they'll know that you came from us, which really helps us out.